did this presentation for my congregation a couple of weeks ago, and surprisingly, they really embraced it. So I thought I'd do an encore this morning and see if it speaks to you where you are in your journey as well. I took a course in my final year of seminary called Systematic Theology. Remember that one? Jack. Bring many names, yes. Systematic Theology. The title of that course suggested to me that finally, my instructors were going to impart their vast knowledge about God to me in a logical, organized way. After all, isn't that what the word systematic means? A system, an organized, methodical way of understanding. What a misnomer that was. How mistaken I was. When the final paper was turned in, and by the way, I did pass the course, I remarked to one of my classmates about the experience of studying systematic theology. And my summation of its semester was, what was that about? I had spent an entire semester in this class, and to this day, I have absolutely no idea what that was all about. It's an interesting experience to take a course and get to the end and pass it, and what was that about, you know? The word theology comes, of course, from two Latin words, theo, meaning God, and logos, meaning word or study. So theology is the study of God. But Unitarians have no creed. We do not require belief in God. Now, I know some of us use that word in expounding on our spiritual journey, and some of us don't. So you might be asking yourself, should I even be talking about theology? Much less trying to put forth a case for one. Some Unitarian Universalists employ God language, some do not. And as a minister in this tradition for some 11 years, I accept either vocabulary. But I do think that it is incumbent upon us, if we want our faith tradition to grow, and I certainly do, I think it is incumbent upon us to be able to explain who we are and where we're coming from in a language that the wider Christian community can at least speak to or understand or grasp in some way. Also, another reason I'm visiting this topic today is I think that every Unitarian Universalist should understand at least a bit about the history of our faith tradition, how it came into being who we are. And it's virtually impossible to do that without knowing just a bit about theology and how theology factored in to the developmental history of Unitarian Universalism. So, I'm visiting this topic this morning for several reasons. I think there is merit in us visiting it for just a few moments this morning. Now, before I do that, though, I want to get a little bit irreverent with you and lighten things up just a little bit. And maybe in the process, make that G word a little more palatable for some of you. There are three great disciplines that humanity has developed to study the great phenomenon of being. Those three disciplines being philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. Each of these three disciplines takes the existential phenomenon of being, of existing, the simple realization that comes to some of us at various points in our journey, the simple realization that I am. I'm here. I exist. Wow. And coming to some way of grasping that, comprehending that, and framing it, that great realization, so that us puny human beings can have a conversation about it. Some way to talk about it. Now, I'm not going to use any great lofty concepts to separate out these three great disciplines or schools of study, if you will. If I did, you'd never remember them. But if I make it a little irreverent, you might. So, here it goes. Philosophy is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat. Metaphysics is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat that doesn't exist. And theology is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat that doesn't exist and saying, I found it! I hope that one will stick with you. I've got a lot of knowledge out of it. This morning I'm going to talk about that search for the black cat. The search for something that doesn't exist. The black cat, in my little irreverent analogy, of course, being God. Searching for something that, I freely admit, doesn't exist. Is that statement shocking to any of you? It should be. Because I'm risking offending those of you here today who might self-identify as theists. Secondly, I myself identify as a theist. I occasionally use the idea of God in expressing my faith. Now I'm saying God is something that doesn't exist. So before you mentally check out on me or take offense or say, "Geez, this preacher's off his rocker," let me explain. When I say God doesn't exist, I'm actually channeling one of the great German theologians of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, who famously said, God is not a being. God is being. Elaborating on this idea, Tillich went on to say, God can't be a being, a thing, because to be so, God would have to be separate from other things. But God necessarily transcends the category of existence. So God is not a thing. God is no thing. There is no such thing as God. Are you with me? I've got the eyeballs. So, God can't be a thing occupying space and time. That would make she, he, it separate from every other thing in creation, which leads to all sorts of illogical fallacies. You would think the atheist would embrace Tillich, but he confounds the atheist as well as most Christians, because he goes on to add this little ditty, Kevin. God is being itself, beyond essence and existence. Therefore, to argue God exists is to deny him. It is as atheistic to affirm the existence of God as it is to deny it. Confused?
Yes.
I've got one confused look back there, Kirby. You may be confused if you are only thinking in either or terms. Tillich's approach requires both and thinking. It is paradoxical. It is multidimensional. Tillich is talking about God as an experience. God not understood as a noun, but as a verb. God as a metaphor for meaning, a way of expressing the sacred dimension of life, regardless of what religious community you claim membership in. And when I personally use the word God, I generally use that word in the same sense. Now, to the development of Unitarian Universalism. Our faith tradition actually started as two separate faiths, both of which were at one time Christian denominations: Unitarianism, Universalism. Both religions originated in part as a protest against two Calvinist doctrines: the total depravity of humanity, or original sin, and predestination, or the doctrine of the elect, the belief that God determined whether or not you will go to heaven before you were even born. The Unitarians were Christians who believed that people should interpret the Bible in light of human reason. Jesus and the Bible were central to their faith, but they regarded Jesus more as a moral and ethical teacher than a supernatural being. Though they did believe in the divinity of Jesus, that he was a son of God, but not the same as God. I might add that Jesus was divine in the same sense that all humanity is divine. The term Unitarian, though, originally meant non-Trinitarian, a belief in one unified God rather than a three-part entity. Universalism originally meant that every person could be saved, whatever that means. Universal salvation, as opposed to the salvation of a few whom God would elect to save. Although Christian, the Universalists did not believe a loving God would condemn people to an eternity in hell. Makes sense to me. They believed that the souls of all dead people would eventually be reconciled to this loving God. Although they waffled and disagreed on how long that process would take. I never really got into those debates. Anyway, throughout the 19th and the early 20th century, Unitarianism and Universalism were liberal Christian alternatives to the more harsh and dogmatic forms of Christianity. All those others that bought into these ideas of the total depravity of humanity and the idea of a hell. During the 20th century, conversations started between the two traditions. And both faith traditions were also starting to move away somewhat from their Christian origin toward a religion based more on individual freedom of belief. So the term Unitarian today has come to mean that we believe in a unity of all life, what our principles and purposes call the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. The term universalism indicates the universality of the religious experience. Again, in our UUA principles and purposes, we affirm that you can find wisdom in all the world's great religious traditions. The difference between the two faith traditions ran more along lines of class and cultural lines than theology, really. The Unitarians attracted white-collar types, professional types, educators, cultural leaders. The Universalists were comprised mostly of blue-collar, working people, farmers, fishermen, fisherwomen. By the middle of the 20th century, the distinctions between the two traditions was becoming more and more blurred, and a merger became not only possible but financially necessary for the survival of the two traditions. And so after several years of negotiations, the Unitarian Universalist Association was formed in 1961. Thank you for bearing with me through that little history lesson. I can say it Starr King said it much more succinctly in distinguishing the two traditions. Starr King was ordained as both a Universalist and a Unitarian minister, interestingly. He explained the difference in the two traditions this way. Universalists believe God is too good to damn them. Unitarians believe they're too good to be damned. Anyway, Unitarian Universalist theology is about unity. Unity. That idea is so important to us that we mention it twice in our very name. Marilyn Sewell, who Kirby quoted, she's now retired from UU ministry. As you mentioned, she wrote this article in the Huffington Post called The Theology of Unitarian Universalist. And her article was her attempt to do just what I'm suggesting that all of us should do better. That is, explain what we believe in terms that the greater Christian community can understand. Here in a concise form is Reverend Sewell's formulation of UU theology. Point 1. We believe that human beings should be free to choose their beliefs according to the dictates of their own conscience. Number 2. We believe in original goodness with the understanding that sin is sometimes chosen, often because of pain or ignorance. We believe that God is one. Point 3. Point 4. We believe that revelation is ever unfolding. Point 5. We believe that the kingdom of God is to be created here on earth. Point 6. We believe that Jesus was a prophet of God, and that other prophets of God have arisen in other faith traditions. Point 7, we believe that love is more important than doctrine. Point 8, we believe that God's mercy will reconcile all unto itself in the end. So, do you have a theology? Have I convinced you? Probably not. When you consider that our congregations are so eclectic, we have people that identify as Christian, yes. We have atheists, yes. We have humanists, yes. Jews, Buddhists, even Wiccans. It would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to articulate a concise, clear theology that encompasses the beliefs of all. Yes, we have our 7 principles, and by no means am I trying to belittle them. Our 7 principles are a central part of what gives us that unity that holds us together as a community. But the principles are a behavioral covenant, not a statement of beliefs. What I've tried to do and continue to try to do this morning is to get at the central ideas that inform those principles. When we look at the history and the practice of our faith, I can say that certain theological themes dominate. And I want to express those theological themes in more humanistic terms. And I think we can do that. And so regardless of your spiritual, your religious identity, or your lack of one, I feel reasonably sure that an articulation of your beliefs would include these 4 things. as a manifestation of the divine. Number 2, human beings must take responsibility for our world. No supernatural divine power is going to come to our rescue. Or at least we need to live as if no supernatural power is going to come to our rescue. Number 3, our focus should be on this life, not what comes after, if anything. Number 4, love is the most powerful force in the universe. Sometimes it just seems like we're a way station, a kind of a support group for those individuals who have left one church or another, but still feel that Sunday morning habit. Sort of the church for the NPR crowd. But what I'm asking, what I'm imploring, I want us to be more than that. I want us to grow into a community that is bigger than the spiritual injuries we have sustained because of our religious past. I want us to be a community that has reached a depth of both individual and collective maturity so that we can go back to those churches and those people who have neglected us or have spiritually abused us or have spoken ill against us, and convey to them something of the inner peace and joy that comes from our more inclusive approach to life upon this planet. May it be so. Amen.